Imagine living in a time when a single man rules over huge parts of Europe. A ruler who decides wars, appoints kings, and sometimes even fights with the Pope for power over the world. One title stands above all others: Kaiser. But the history of the German emperors is much more than just a series of rulers. It is a story of power, faith, intrigue, great battles, and dramatic downfalls. From the legendary Charlemagne to Frederick Barbarossa and the emperors of the German Empire, they shaped the history of Europe for more than 1,000 years. But before we begin, I have a question for you. Welcher deutsche Kaiser ist deiner Meinung nach der bedeutendste Geschichte? Und warum? Be sure to write your answer in the comments below. I'm curious to see which names are mentioned most often. And if history fascinates you and you want to see more such stories about empires, rulers, and great turning points of the past, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. In this way, you support the channel and don't miss any more historical stories. And now we travel back more than 1,200 years, to the moment when the empire was reborn in the heart of Europe. Chapter 1 Prologue. What is an emperor? When we hear the word emperor today, many people immediately think of powerful rulers, vast empires, magnificent crowns, and figures from the history books who ruled over millions of people. But the title emperor is more than just a particularly noble name for a king. Behind this word lies a long history of power, symbolism, politics, and an idea that has shaped entire continents for centuries. To understand what an emperor really is, we have to travel several millennia into the past. Because the origin of this title does not lie in Germany, not in the Middle Ages, and not in the Holy Roman Empire. Its roots go back to the world of Roman antiquity. The term emperor goes back to the name Gaius Julius Caesar. Originally, Caesar was simply a family name. Julius Caesar was a Roman politician, general, and one of the most famous men of his time. In the 1st century BC, he played a decisive role in the power struggle of the Roman Republic. After a series of spectacular military successes, especially in what is now France, which was then called Gaul, he became one of the most powerful men in Rome. But Julius Caesar wanted more than just influence. Step by step, he accumulated political power in his hands until he was finally appointed dictator for life. For many Romans, this was a dangerous step, because the Roman Republic was originally designed to ensure that no one had too much power. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar was finally murdered by a group of senators who believed that they could save the Republic. Ironically, however, his death did not lead to the salvation of the Republic, but to its final end. After a long civil war, Caesar's adopted son Octavian took power. He later became known as Augustus and is considered the first Roman emperor. Augustus understood that open dictatorship was dangerous. Instead, he created a system that continued to look like a republic to the outside world, but was in fact controlled by him. The name Caesar played a decisive role in this. Augustus adopted this name and made it a title of dominion. From then on, Caesar was associated with the highest political power. Subsequent Roman rulers continued to use this title, and over time, the name of a single man became a symbol of the highest office in the state. As the Roman Empire spread across Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East, the idea of the emperor also spread. The emperor was not only a political ruler, but also a kind of supreme guarantor of order, stability, and unity in the empire. Millions of people lived under his rule, often in regions that had different languages, cultures, and traditions. This is precisely why the emperor had a special role. While local kings or governors ruled over individual territories, the emperor stood above them all. He was, so to speak, the ruler over the rulers. Over time, however, the Roman Empire changed greatly. In 395, it was finally divided into two parts, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. While the west of the empire was increasingly weakened by crises, economic problems, and attacks by Germanic tribes, the East continued to develop more stably. Finally, in 476, something happened that many historians consider the symbolic end of antiquity. The last Western Roman emperor was deposed. This meant that the imperial title disappeared in Western Europe, at least temporarily. But the emperor's idea had by no means disappeared. She lived on in the East. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we know today as the Byzantine Empire, retained the title of emperor for many centuries. The emperors of Constantinople continued to see themselves as the legitimate successors of the Roman rulers. For them, their empire was the real Rome, even though the capital had long since ceased to be in Italy. Meanwhile, a whole new political landscape was developing in Western Europe. After the collapse of the Roman administration, numerous new empires emerged. The Germanic kingdoms that formed on the former territories of the Roman Empire became particularly important. One of these empires would later play a decisive role in the history of the emperors, the Frankish Empire. The Franks were originally an association of various Germanic tribes. Over time, their rulers managed to bring large parts of Western Europe under their control. Especially under the Carolingian dynasty, their power grew enormously. But even though these rulers were kings, the idea of empire remained alive. Many people in Europe saw the ancient Roman Empire as an ideal image of order and unity. An emperor symbolized a kind of universal rule, a power that went beyond individual kingdoms. At the same time, the Church played an increasingly important role. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Pope in Rome developed into one of the most important authorities in Europe. The Church preserved many traditions of the Roman world and saw itself as the spiritual successor of the empire. Therefore, over the centuries, an exciting political idea emerged. If there were to be an emperor in the West again, he would not only have to be a powerful ruler, but also recognized by the Church. This connection between secular power and religious legitimacy was later to become decisive. Because an emperor was not just a stronger king. While a king usually ruled over a certain people or a clearly defined area, the emperor had a higher claim. It was supposed to represent an empire that was larger than individual nations or tribes. In the imagination of many people, the emperor was the protector of the Christian world. However, this idea was never entirely unproblematic, because it inevitably led to conflicts. When an emperor claimed to be the highest secular authority, the question immediately arose: who has more power, the emperor or the pope? This question was to occupy Europe for centuries and lead to some of the most dramatic political conflicts of the Middle Ages. But before these conflicts could begin, the empire in the West had to re-emerge in the first place. This required a ruler strong enough to unite large parts of Europe. A man who had military power, political skills, and a close connection to the Church. A ruler whose influence was so great that many contemporaries already regarded him as a kind of new Roman emperor. This man was Charlemagne. Under his rule, one of the most powerful empires in Europe since the fall of Rome emerged. His armies conquered vast territories, his administration reformed the empire, and his connection to the Church made him one of the most important political actors of his time. Finally, on Christmas Eve in the year 800, something happened that would change the history of Europe forever. In St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Charles put a crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. With this coronation, the imperial title officially returned to Western Europe. Many historians see this moment as the birth of a new political idea, an idea that would later lead to the Holy Roman Empire and shape the history of German emperors for many centuries. But this development was by no means predetermined. It arose from political interests, religious ideas, and the desire for order in a world that was constantly changing. The history of the German emperors thus begins not only with individual rulers, but with an idea, the idea of an empire greater than all others and a ruler who stands above kings. In the coming chapters, we will see how this idea came about, how it developed, and why it was to shape Europe for more than 1,000 years. But before we get to Charlemagne and his legendary coronation, we need to take a closer look at the world in which this new form of empire was able to emerge. Chapter 2: The Roots, from the Roman Empire to the Frankish Empire. To understand how the empire later came to Central Europe and eventually to Germany, we must first take a look at the world from which this idea originally emerged. Long before there were German emperors, there was already an empire that was the political, cultural, and military center of the known world for many centuries, the Roman Empire. At the time of its greatest expansion, this empire stretched over 3 continents. In the west, it reached as far as the Atlantic, in the north to the borders of Germania and Britain, in the east as far as Syria, and in the south deep into North Africa. Millions of people of different origins lived under Roman rule. They spoke different languages, had different traditions, and worshipped numerous gods, but they all belonged to a single political entity. This empire was held together not only by its armies, but also by a highly developed administration, an elaborate road network, and a common legal system. Rome was the center of this world. From here, decisions were made that affected the lives of people who lived thousands of miles away. But no empire, no matter how powerful it seems, remains unchanged forever. As early as the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire began to struggle with ever greater challenges. Economic crises, political instability, and military threats on the borders increasingly affected the empire. A particular problem was the enormous size of the empire. Managing such a vast area was difficult, and fast communication over long distances was hardly possible. Therefore, in the late 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian decided to undertake a radical reform. The empire was administratively divided into several parts, which were ruled by different emperors. This system was intended to improve control over the empire, but in the long term it led to a development that would permanently change the political face of Europe. In 395, the empire was finally divided into 2 halves, the Western Roman Empire, with its capital in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople. While the East developed relatively stably, the West came under increasing pressure. Various peoples, whom the Romans often referred to as barbarians, pushed to the borders of the empire or settled within the Roman territories. These groups, including Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, and Franks, were by no means primitive tribes, as older accounts often claimed. Many of them already had close contact with Roman culture. Some even served in the Roman army or lived within the empire's borders. But in the course of the 5th century, the political order of the Western Roman Empire began to falter more and more. Power struggles within the Roman elite, economic problems, and military defeats weakened the central authority. At the same time, various Germanic groups founded their own empires on former Roman territory. The symbolic turning point came in 476. In this year, the Germanic military commander Otto deposed the last Western Roman emperor. This young ruler, Romulus Augustulus, had only been a kind of puppet anyway. With his deposition, the imperial title disappeared in Western Europe, at least officially. For many people, however, this event did not mean the end of the Roman world. Roman culture, the legal system, the administration, and above all, Christianity continued to be preserved. Cities, roads, and trade networks continued to exist, even as they changed. During this time, an institution that became increasingly influential became particularly important: the Christian Church. While political structures collapsed and new kingdoms emerged, the Church remained a stable factor. Bishops often took on tasks that had previously been performed by Roman officials. They organized help for those in need, mediated in conflicts, and preserved education and written culture. The Bishop of Rome, who later became known as Pope, gained more and more importance during this time. Rome itself was no longer the political center of a great empire, but as the seat of the Pope, the city remained a symbol of authority and tradition. At the same time, new centers of power developed on the former territories of the Western Roman Empire. The Empire of the Franks became particularly important. The Franks were originally not a unified people, but an association of various Germanic groups that lived along the Rhine. Over time, however, their leaders managed to gain control of larger and larger areas. The decisive rise began with a ruler named Clovis in the late 5th century. Clovis was an ambitious and militarily successful king. Through a series of campaigns, he managed to defeat rival groups and conquer large parts of present-day France as well as adjacent regions. But Clovis's success was not only based on military strength. One of his most important decisions was of a religious nature. He was baptized into Christianity. This decision had enormous political consequences. While many other Germanic rulers followed another Christian movement, the so-called Arianism, Clovis joined the Roman Catholic Church. In doing so, he won the support of the powerful bishops and the Romansh population, which was still strongly influenced by Roman culture. This combination of Germanic rule and Roman Christian tradition gave rise to something new, a political order that combined elements of the old Roman world as well as the new Germanic power structures. The Frankish Empire continued to grow in the following centuries. Different dynasties ruled over the area, but over time, the actual power increasingly shifted from the kings to their highest officials, the so-called Hausmayrs. These Hausmayrs were originally administrators of the royal court. But over time, they became the real rulers in the empire. One family in particular gained more and more influence, the Carolingians. The best-known representative of this family was Karl Martel, a powerful Hausmayr of the early 8th century. Charles Martel became famous for his military success against a Muslim army in the Battle of Tours in 732. This victory made him one of the most important figures of his time. Charles Martel himself, however, never accepted the title of king. His son Pippin the Younger was eventually to take this step. With the support of the Pope, Pippin deposed the last Merovingian king and had himself crowned king of the Franks. This close cooperation between the Franconian royal family and the Church was later to play a decisive role. The Pope needed military protection against political opponents in Italy, while the Frankish rulers strengthened their legitimacy through the support of the Church. This alliance developed into a relationship that was to shape Europe for centuries. Pippin's son would eventually become the most famous ruler of his time, a man whose name is still associated with power, reform, and expansion, Charlemagne. Under his leadership, the Frankish Empire grew into a political power that encompassed large parts of Europe. His campaigns expanded the empire in many directions, and his administration reformed the structures of the state. But Charlemagne was not only a successful general. He also understood the importance of symbols and traditions. In a world where the memory of the Roman Empire was still alive, the idea of a new emperor offered a powerful political vision. A ruler who was not only king of a people, but also claimed to continue Rome's legacy in Western Europe. This vision was eventually to become reality. At the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne was at the height of his power. His empire extended over large parts of today's France, Germany, Italy, and beyond. His relations with the Church were close, and the Pope in Rome saw him as an important ally. All these factors led to an event that was to change the political history of Europe forever. On Christmas Eve in the year 800, numerous clergy and nobles gathered in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. During a church service, the Pope stepped before Charlemagne and put a crown on his head. With this coronation, Charles was declared Emperor of the Romans. More than 3 centuries after the end of the Western Roman Empire, the title of Emperor returned to Western Europe, and with it an idea that was to form the basis for the later history of the German emperors. But how exactly this coronation came about, what political motives were behind it, and what consequences it had, we will see in the next chapter. Chapter 3: Charlemagne, the first emperor of the West. As the 8th century drew to a close, Europe was a changing world. The old Roman Empire had long since ceased to exist in the West, but its memory lived on, in the ruins of ancient cities, in the laws that were still shaped by Roman traditions, and above all in the Church, which had preserved many elements of Roman administration and culture. It was during this period that a ruler appeared on the stage of history whose influence was to become so great that many of his contemporaries already considered him the heir to the Roman emperors, Charlemagne. Charles was probably born in 742, the son of the Frankish king Pippin the Younger. His family belonged to the Carolingian dynasty, which had only recently taken over the Frankish royal throne. When Pippin died in 768, the empire was divided among his 2 sons according to the tradition of the time. Charles and his brother Carloman were to rule together. However, this dual power was difficult from the beginning. Rivalries between brothers were not uncommon in the early Middle Ages, and there were also tensions between Karl and Charlemagne. But fate intervened early on. Only a few years after her father's death, Charlemagne died unexpectedly in 771. Charles thus became the sole ruler of the Frankish Empire. From that moment on, one of the most remarkable reigns of the Middle Ages began. Charles was not only a skillful politician, but also an energetic general. In the decades that followed, he led numerous military campaigns that made the Frankish Empire one of the largest political powers in Europe. One of Charlemagne's longest and most difficult conflicts was against the Saxons, a Germanic people who lived in the regions of today's northern Germany. These wars lasted several decades and were marked by harsh violence, uprisings, and forced conversions. Charles saw these conflicts not only as a political or military challenge, but also as a religious mission. For him, the spread of Christianity was a central part of his rule. The Saxons, who continued to practice their traditional pagan religions, were to be integrated into Christian Europe, by force if necessary. After many years of resistance, Charles finally succeeded in subjugating the Saxons and incorporating their territory into his empire. But its expansion was not limited to the north. In the south and east, too, Charles led campaigns against various peoples and rulers. He fought against the Lombards in Italy, against the Avars in Central Europe, and against various smaller principalities along the borders of his empire. These military successes made Charles one of the most powerful rulers of his time. His empire eventually extended over a vast area that included large parts of present-day France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy. But Charles was not only a warrior. He also understood that such a large empire needed more than military strength. It had to be organized, managed, and culturally held together. Therefore, Charles began a series of reforms that are later often referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance. He promoted education and scholarship, had monasteries and schools founded, and brought scholars from different parts of Europe to his court. One of the most famous among them was the English scholar Alcuin of York, who played an important role in educational reforms. Charlemagne wanted clergy and officials to be able to read and write so that they could correctly pass on laws, religious texts, and administrative documents. At a time when education was often only accessible to a few people, this was a significant step. The administration of his empire was also reformed. Charles appointed so-called counts, who were responsible for justice, taxes, and military organization in various regions of his empire. To ensure that these local rulers performed their duties correctly, Charles regularly sent royal envoys, known as missi dominici, throughout the empire to collect reports and check compliance with the laws. These measures helped maintain control over a vast and culturally diverse area. While Charles was consolidating his power in Western Europe, another important political development was taking place in the south. In Italy, the Pope was increasingly in a difficult situation. Various political forces threatened his position, and conflicts arose again and again, especially in Rome itself. For the Pope, the powerful Frankish king was therefore an important ally. Charles, in turn, also benefited from this relationship. The support of the Pope gave his rule a religious legitimacy. At a time when many people believed that political power was bestowed by God, church recognition was hugely important. This close connection between Charles and the Pope eventually led to an event that was to change the history of Europe forever. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charles was in Rome. During a solemn service in St. Peter's Basilica, something happened that would later be considered one of the most symbolic moments in European history. When Charles knelt before the altar during Mass, the Pope stepped behind him and placed a golden crown on his head. Then the assembled crowd shouted, "Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-bringing Emperor of the Romans." With this act, Charles was officially declared emperor. This coronation was of enormous political importance. More than 3 centuries after the end of the Western Roman Empire, there was once again an emperor in Western Europe. But this decision was by no means without controversy. In the East, the Byzantine Empire continued to exist, whose rulers also considered themselves legitimate Roman emperors. From their point of view, there could only be one Roman emperor, and he was in Constantinople. Despite these tensions, Charles's imperial title prevailed in the West. For many people, his coronation symbolized the rebirth of a Christian empire. Charles was seen not only as king of the Franks, but as the protector of the entire Christian world in Western Europe. Interestingly, some sources report that Charles himself is said to have been surprised by the coronation. Later chroniclers wrote that he might not have attended the service at all if he had known what the Pope was planning. Whether this story is really true is disputed among historians. Many suspect that Karl at least had an idea of what was going to happen. After all, such a coronation was a complex political event that could hardly have been organized completely unexpectedly. Regardless, the coronation had enormous implications. It created a new political tradition, the idea of a Western Empire that was closely linked to the Church and would carry on the legacy of the Roman Empire. Charlemagne reigned for many years after his coronation as emperor. Until his death in 814, he remained a central figure in European politics. His rule laid the foundation for political structures that had an impact far beyond his own lifetime. But despite his enormous power, an important question remained unanswered: what would happen after his death? Charles had created a vast empire, but like so many empires before it, this empire depended on the stability of its leadership. The coming generations would show whether Charlemagne's work could last in the long term. His son Louis the Pious was to take over the empire, but it soon became apparent that the unity of the Carolingian Empire was difficult to maintain. Internal conflicts, power struggles, and territorial divisions would eventually weaken the empire and cause it to disintegrate into several parts. But although Charlemagne's empire would later break up, his coronation as emperor in 800 remained a pivotal moment in European history. For it laid the foundation for a tradition that centuries later would lead to the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire, an empire whose emperors saw themselves as successors to Charlemagne and heirs to the Roman Empire. How this empire developed and why its history is closely linked to the early German kings, we will see in the next chapter. Chapter 4: The Carolingian Legacy, Decay and New Kingdoms. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left behind one of the greatest empires Europe had seen since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. His empire extended over large parts of Western Europe and united different peoples, languages, and traditions under a common political order. To many contemporaries, it seemed that Charles had indeed created a new empire, a Christian empire that recalled the greatness of ancient Rome. But as so often in history, a crucial question soon arose: what happens to an empire when its great founder is no longer alive? In the case of the Carolingian Empire, the answer was initially in the hands of Charlemagne's only surviving son, Louis the Pious. Ludwig had already been involved in important political decisions during his father's lifetime. Charles had elevated him to co-emperor and thus prepared the transfer of power. When Charles died, Ludwig was therefore able to take over the reign relatively easily. But Ludwig's reign was to show that there was a difference between inheriting a large empire and building it himself. While Charlemagne was known as an energetic conqueror and determined ruler, Louis was considered more religious and less militarily oriented. His nickname, the Pious, already indicates how much he devoted himself to the Christian faith and church reforms. Under his rule, the church continued to gain influence. Louis supported monasteries, promoted religious reform movements, and tried to order the empire more closely according to Christian principles. But at the same time, he was confronted with political challenges that increasingly weakened his position. A central problem lay in an old tradition of Frankish rule, the division of the empire among the sons of a ruler. In today's world, it seems self-evident that a state passes undivided to a single successor. In the early Middle Ages, however, this was by no means the rule. Instead, an empire was often divided among several heirs, with each son receiving his own share. This practice was intended to ensure peace within the family, but often led to the opposite. Louis the Pious also had several sons. In order to avoid future conflicts, he tried early on to regulate the division of his empire. In 817, He issued a document that became known as the Ordinatio Imperii. In this arrangement, Louis appointed his eldest son Lothar as co-emperor and overlord of the entire empire. His younger sons were also to receive dominions, but were to be under the authority of Lothar. On paper, this solution seemed stable. In reality, however, it led to new tensions. In the Middle Ages, political power was closely linked to personal influence, military strength, and the loyalty of nobles. Many regional rulers each supported different members of the royal family, which quickly turned rivalries within the dynasty into major conflicts. The situation became even more complicated when Louis later had another son, Charles, who would later become known as Charles the Bald. In order to secure a part of the empire for this youngest son as well, Louis changed his original plans several times. However, these changes meant that his older sons felt disadvantaged. What followed were years of political intrigue, alliances, and open rebellion. Several times Louis's own sons rose up against him. In some cases, they even managed to temporarily depose their father. These intra-family conflicts shook the stability of the empire and considerably weakened the central authority of the emperor. When Louis the Pious finally died in 840, the empire was already deeply divided. His sons, Lothar, Ludwig the German, and Charles the Bald, immediately began an open power struggle for control of the empire. This conflict developed into a civil war that was to last several years. One of the decisive moments of this conflict was the Battle of Fontenoy in 841. In this bloody conflict, the armies of the brothers faced each other. Ludwig the German and Charles the Bald fought together against their older brother Lothar. The battle was devastating. Contemporary chroniclers reported enormous losses on both sides. But in the end, Ludwig and Karl were able to achieve a decisive victory. A year later, in 842, the two brothers concluded a famous alliance, the Strasbourg Oaths. This event is not only of great political importance, but also of linguistic history. The oaths were taken in two different languages, an early form of French and an early form of German. This makes them among the oldest written testimonies of these languages. The Strasbourg Oaths symbolized the alliance between Louis the German and Charles the Bald against their brother Lothar. But the conflict could not be finally ended until a year later. In 843, the brothers finally agreed on a permanent division of the empire. This agreement is known as the Treaty of Verdun. With this treaty, the Carolingian Empire was officially divided into three large parts. Lothar, the eldest brother, retained the title of emperor and received an elongated area that stretched from northern Italy through today's Burgundy to the Netherlands. This area is often referred to as the Middle Kingdom today. Louis the German received the eastern territories of the empire, most of which lay east of the Rhine. These regions later formed the core of what we know as the East Franconian Empire, a political entity from which the German kingdom would later develop. Charles the Bald finally received the western territories of the former empire, from which the West Franconian Empire developed in the long term, which was later to become France. The Treaty of Verdun therefore marks a decisive moment in European history. Even if the people of that time did not yet speak of Germany or France in the modern sense, this division laid the foundation for the later political development of Europe. Charlemagne's former empire had thus finally collapsed. But although the empire was politically divided, the idea of the empire remained. The imperial title was initially retained in the line of Lothar, but the power of this Middle Kingdom was relatively unstable. The geographical shape of the area made effective administration difficult, and after Lothar's death, this kingdom was again divided among his heirs. In the course of the 9th century, the political center of Europe shifted more and more eastwards, to the East Franconian Empire. New power structures developed there. Regional dukes gained increasing influence, while the Carolingian dynasty slowly lost importance. Finally, in 911, the last East Frankish king from the Carolingian line died. This marked an important turning point. For the first time, the nobles of the East Franconian Empire had to elect a new king who did not come from Charlemagne's direct family. This election led to the coronation of Conrad I, a Duke of Franconia. This decision marked the beginning of a new phase of political development. The East Franconian Empire increasingly developed into an independent political space. While the French kingdom was slowly forming in the West, a structure emerged in the East from which the Holy Roman Empire would later emerge. But at that time, the imperial title had not yet been re-established in the East. This once again required an extraordinary ruler, a king strong enough to unite the various duchies, establish order in the empire, and finally renew the claim to the empire. This ruler was to appear in the 10th century. His name was Otto, and his coronation in 962 was to mark the beginning of a new era. In the next chapter, we will see how a new empire emerged from the East Franconian Empire and why Otto the Great is often considered the actual founder of the medieval German Empire. Chapter 5: Otto the Great, the birth of the Holy Roman Empire. After the collapse of Charlemagne's great empire, Europe was divided into several political areas. In the West, the Kingdom of France slowly developed, while in the East the so-called East Frankish Empire emerged, an empire consisting of various duchies and in which powerful regional princes played an important role. This empire was not a centralized state in the modern sense. Instead, it consisted of several large tribal duchies, including Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Lorraine. Each of these regions had its own traditions, its own noble families, and its own political interests. The king of the East Franconian Empire therefore not only had to rule, but above all mediate. His power depended heavily on whether the powerful dukes were willing to support him. At the beginning of the 10th century, the political situation in Central Europe was uncertain. In addition to internal rivalries, external enemies also threatened the empire. The Hungarians were particularly feared, whose cavalry armies repeatedly penetrated deep into the territories of the empire and devastated entire regions. In this difficult situation, a new dynasty emerged, the Littlefingers, also known as the Ottonians. The rise of this family began with a man named Heinrich I, who later received the nickname the Vogler. In 919, Henry was elected king by the East Frankish princes. This election was an important step in the development of the empire. Unlike previous rulers from the Carolingian family, Henry did not have to derive his authority from dynastic descent alone. Instead, his power was based on the approval of the leading nobles. Henry knew how to work skillfully with the various duchies. Instead of immediately trying to limit their power, he first sought political compromises. At the same time, he began to strengthen the empire militarily. His strategy of defense against the Hungarians was particularly important. Henry had a network of fortified towns and castles built, which were to serve as protection points for the population. He also reformed the army of the empire. These measures strengthened the security of the empire considerably. When Henry died in 936, he left behind a more stable kingdom than the one he had once taken over. But his most important decision was perhaps the preparation of the succession. His son Otto was to take over his inheritance. Otto was crowned king in the same year in the city of Aachen, exactly in the place where Charlemagne had once exercised his power. This choice was no coincidence. It was intended to symbolize that Otto saw himself as the heir to the Carolingian tradition. But Otto's reign did not begin without difficulties. Many nobles in the empire were skeptical about the new king. Some dukes feared that Otto would try to limit their power. In the first years of his government, there were several uprisings as a result. Even members of his own family took part in these rebellions. Otto's half-brother Thankmar and later also his own son Ludolf temporarily opposed him. But Otto showed himself to be a determined ruler. With military strength and political skill, he succeeded in putting down these uprisings and consolidating his authority. An important part of his policy was close cooperation with the church. Otto recognized that bishops and abbots could play a special role in the empire. Unlike secular nobles, clergymen could not found dynasties because they had no legitimate heirs. This meant that their offices could be reassigned after their deaths, often by the king himself. Otto therefore began to deliberately bring bishops and abbots into important political positions. This system, which later became known as the Imperial Church system, helped him establish loyal administrators throughout the empire. While Otto consolidated his power internally, the threat from outside also remained. The Hungarians in particular continue to pose a great danger. In 955, a decisive confrontation finally occurred. A large Hungarian army again invaded the territory of the empire. Otto opposed them with his army, and both armies met near the city of Augsburg in a field that later became known as Lechfeld. The battle that took place there was to become one of the most important military events of the early Middle Ages. Despite the dreaded equestrian tactics of the Hungarians, Otto's army managed to decisively defeat the attackers. The victory on the Lechfeld ended the decades-long Hungarian raids into Central Europe. For Otto, this victory had enormous political significance. Many contemporaries now saw in him not only a successful king, but also a protector of Christian Europe. His prestige grew enormously. But while Otto consolidated his power in the north and east, a new political situation developed in the south, which was ultimately to lead to the rebirth of the empire. At that time, complex power relations prevailed in Italy. Various noble families fought for influence, and the Pope was also involved in these conflicts. Pope John XII finally felt compelled to seek help from outside. He recognized in Otto a powerful ally capable of restoring order in Italy. Otto followed this call. He moved to Italy with an army, stabilized the political situation, and presented himself as the protector of the Pope. This development was strongly reminiscent of the events surrounding Charlemagne more than a century and a half earlier. And indeed, a similar moment was soon to be repeated. In 962, Otto traveled to Rome. There, a solemn ceremony took place in St. Peter's Basilica to commemorate the coronation of Charlemagne. Pope John XII put a crown on Otto and declared him emperor. With this coronation, the idea of the Western Empire was officially revived. More than 150 years after Charlemagne, another empire emerged in the heart of Europe. But this new empire differed from Charlemagne's empire in some important ways. While Charles had ruled over a largely unified empire, Otto's power was more closely linked to the structures of the East Frankish Empire. His empire was based on an alliance between king, nobility, and church. Over time, this political order developed into what later became known as the Holy Roman Empire. Although the name itself did not emerge until a few centuries later, the foundations of this empire were laid with Otto's coronation as emperor. Otto the Great ruled as emperor for a few more years and consolidated his power in both Germany and Italy. However, his empire remained a complex structure in which many different interests had to be balanced. Nevertheless, he managed to create a stable foundation for future generations. When Otto died in 973, he left his son Otto II an empire that had gained in importance both politically and symbolically. The imperial dignity was now once again firmly associated with the rulers of the East Franconian German Empire. This marked the beginning of a new era in European history, an era in which the German kings regularly went to Rome to be crowned emperor by the Pope. But this close connection between emperor and pope was not always to remain harmonious. On the contrary, in the centuries that followed, it developed into one of the greatest power conflicts of the Middle Ages. But before these conflicts begin, we will take a look at the Ottonian dynasty in the next chapter, the dynasty that initially stabilized and expanded the new empire. Chapter 6: The Ottonian Islands, Building Empire and Power. The coronation of Otto the Great as emperor in 962 marked the beginning of a new phase in European history. For the first time since the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, a strong empire existed again in the center of Europe. But this new empire was not an easy successor to Charlemagne's empire. It was a complex political entity made up of many different regions, principalities, and power interests. The dynasty that initially shaped this empire was the Ottonians, a ruling family whose influence was to determine the political structure of Central Europe for almost a century. When Otto the Great died in 973, the crown passed to his son Otto II. He had already gained important political experience during his father's lifetime. As a young man, he had already been elevated to co-emperor, a measure intended to secure the transfer of power. But although Otto II had a solid foundation to fall back on, his reign was marked by new challenges. The empire he had taken over was large and influential, but by no means completely stable. The emperor's power continued to be based on a delicate balance between different political forces: the dukes, the bishops, the regional nobles, and the church. Otto II tried to maintain this balance while strengthening imperial authority. An important part of his policy was the continuation of the so-called imperial church system, which had already been developed by his father. In this system, bishops and abbots played a central role in the administration of the empire. Since clergymen had no legitimate heirs, their offices could be reassigned by the emperor after their death. This created a network of church dignitaries who owed their position directly to the emperor and were therefore often loyal to him. This system helped balance the power of the secular dukes, who could otherwise become too dominant. But despite this strategy, Otto's rule was not free of conflicts. New tensions developed, especially in southern Europe. Otto II tried to expand the influence of the empire in the Mediterranean region as well. In the process, he came into conflict with the Byzantines and with Muslim rulers in southern Italy. In 982, he finally suffered a heavy military defeat at the Battle of Stylo. This defeat weakened Otto's position considerably and shook the confidence of many princes in the empire. Only 1 year later, in 983, Otto II died unexpectedly at the age of only 28. His son Otto III was still a small child at that time. The situation was politically sensitive. A huge empire now had to be ruled by a minor king. In such moments, there was often the threat of power struggles between rival noble families. But Otto's mother Theophanu played a decisive role in overcoming this crisis. Theophanu was a Byzantine princess who had married Otto II. She brought not only political experience, but also cultural influences from the Byzantine Empire. During her son's minority, she effectively took over the government of the empire. Together with the Empress Dowager Adelheid, she succeeded in securing the stability of the rule. This phase shows how important individual personalities could be for the political stability of the medieval empire. When Otto III finally took over the government himself, he developed his very own vision of the empire. He was an extraordinary ruler, young, highly educated, and strongly influenced by religious ideas. Otto III saw himself not only as the king or emperor of a particular country, but as the ruler of a universal Christian empire. His imagination was strongly influenced by the memory of the ancient Roman Empire. Otto wanted to create a kind of new Christian empire that would unite Europe politically and religiously. Rome played a central role in this vision. For this reason, he shifted part of his political focus to Italy and often stayed in Rome. There he worked closely with reform-oriented church leaders and supported the election of popes who shared his vision of a renewed Christian empire. But this policy also had disadvantages. Many princes in the northern part of the empire felt neglected. While Otto was intensively involved in Italian affairs, tensions between different aristocratic groups grew in Germany. Moreover, his vision of a universal empire may have been too idealistic for the political reality of his time. In 1002, Otto III died unexpectedly at the age of only 21. With his death, the direct line of the Ottonians ended. The question of succession once again presented the empire with a challenge. Finally, Henry II, a distant relative from the same dynasty, was elected king. Henry II was a very different ruler than Otto III. While Otto had been influenced by great visionary ideas, Heinrich concentrated more on practical politics. He tried to stabilize order in the empire and to strengthen relations between king, nobility, and church. Henry also continued to rely heavily on the imperial church system. He supported monasteries and bishops and worked closely with church reform movements. His close connection to the church later even led to him being canonized after his death, a rare award for a medieval ruler. Under Henry II, The empire remained relatively stable, but he also had to deal with various political challenges. Especially in the east, there were conflicts with the emerging Polish kingdom, which gained influence under its ruler Bolesław Chrobry. Several military conflicts determined this phase of imperial policy. Despite these conflicts, Henry managed to preserve the basic structures of the empire. When he died in 1024, the Ottonian dynasty finally ended. But her political legacy was enormous. The Ottonians had not only revived the empire, but also created a political order that would last for centuries. They had strengthened the alliance between the emperor and the church, organized the administration of the empire, and established a tradition in which German kings traveled to Rome to receive the imperial crown. At the same time, however, the empire remained a complex structure of many different centers of power. The emperor was the highest authority, but his power was never absolute. He had to constantly negotiate with dukes, bishops, and other princes in order to enforce political decisions. This structure made the empire flexible, but also prone to conflict. After the end of the Ottonian dynasty, a new dynasty took over, the Salians. Under these rulers, the empire was initially to be further strengthened. But at the same time, a conflict developed that would shake the medieval world. It was about a fundamental question of power. Who has the right to appoint bishops, the emperor or the pope? This dispute would eventually lead to the famous Investiture Controversy, a conflict that would change the relationship between secular and spiritual power for centuries. In the next chapter, we will see how this conflict arose, and why it led the Holy Roman Empire into one of its greatest crises. Chapter 7: The Salians and the Investiture Controversy. When the Ottonian dynasty ended in 1024 with the death of Henry II, the empire was once again faced with an important decision. The great princes of the empire had to elect a new king, a ruler strong enough to ensure order in the empire while continuing the tradition of the empire. They chose Conrad II, a powerful nobleman from the Salian family. His coronation marked the beginning of a new dynasty that would lead the empire into one of the most dramatic and conflict-ridden phases of its history. Conrad II proved to be a determined and pragmatic ruler. It continued many political structures that had already emerged under the Ottonian dynasty. In particular, the imperial church system remained a central component of imperial power. Like his predecessors, Conrad understood that bishops and abbots could be important allies. Since they had no legitimate descendants, their offices could be reassigned after their death, often by the emperor himself. This practice was widespread in the Middle Ages and was called investiture. The term describes the ceremonial act in which a ruler presents a bishop or abbot with the symbols of his office, usually a ring and staff. This meant that the clergyman was not only appointed to his ecclesiastical office, but often also received secular rights, such as land ownership or jurisdiction. For the emperors, this system was extremely useful. It allowed them to fill important positions in the empire with loyal people. But it was precisely this practice that would later lead to one of the greatest conflicts of the Middle Ages. At first, however, Conrad's rule was relatively stable. He strengthened royal authority and was able to consolidate his power in both Germany and Italy. In 1027 he traveled to Rome, where he was crowned emperor by the Pope. This coronation once again confirmed the tradition that German kings could also claim the imperial dignity, a connection between German royalty and Roman Empire that was to shape the empire for centuries. Conrad II ruled until his death in 1039 and left his son a strong empire. This son was Henry III, one of the most powerful emperors of the Middle Ages. Under Henry III, the Salian Empire initially reached a peak of its power. Henry was an energetic ruler who exerted great influence both in the empire and in Italy. His role in church politics was particularly remarkable. At that time, the church itself was in crisis. Several rival popes claimed the office at the same time, and corruption and political intrigues had severely damaged the reputation of the church. Heinrich intervened. In 1046, he traveled to Italy and convened a church assembly at which several competing popes were deposed. He then supported the election of a new pope who was reform-oriented. These events showed how great the emperor's influence on the church was at that time. But while Henry believed that the church would be strengthened, a new idea developed within the church reform movement. The church should become more independent of secular power. Many clergymen were of the opinion that kings and emperors had too much influence on church affairs. In particular, the investiture, i.e. the installation of bishops by secular rulers, was increasingly criticized. After Henry's death in 1056, his son Henry IV became king. But Henry IV was only 6 years old at the time. As with Otto III before him, this meant a period of minority in which other people had to take over the government. This period considerably weakened royal authority. When Henry finally took power himself, he was confronted with numerous challenges. There was unrest among the princes in the empire, especially in Saxony, where nobles rose up against his rule. At the same time, the conflict between the emperor and the church intensified. At the center of this conflict was a man determined to redefine the power of the church, Pope Gregory VII. Gregory was one of the leading minds of the church reform movement. He was convinced that the church must be independent of secular rulers. In his reforms, he declared, among other things, that only the church had the right to appoint bishops. For Gregory, it was inconceivable that a secular ruler could award ecclesiastical offices. In doing so, he directly questioned decades of practice. Henry IV was not prepared to accept this demand. For him, the investiture was a central component of his power in the empire. If he gave up this right, his political position would be considerably weakened. The conflict between the emperor and the pope quickly escalated. In 1076, Gregory VII declared that Henry IV had been deposed and excommunicated him. Henry was thus excluded from the community of the church. For a medieval ruler, this was an extremely serious situation. Many people believed at the time that an excommunicated king lost his legitimacy. In addition, his subjects could now claim that they no longer had to obey him. In fact, many princes in the empire took advantage of this opportunity to oppose Henry. In order to save his rule, Henry decided to take a dramatic step. In the winter of 1077, he crossed the Alps and traveled to Italy to personally ask the Pope for forgiveness. The two finally met at Canossa Castle. According to legend, Henry had to wait barefoot in the snow outside the gates of the castle for several days until the Pope was ready to receive him. Finally, Gregor granted him absolution and lifted the excommunication. This scene later became one of the most famous events in medieval history. The expression gang nach Canossa is still symbolic of humiliating submission. But in reality, the conflict was far from over. The political tensions in the empire remained. Several princes even elected an anti-king, and the civil war in the empire lasted many years. Finally, Henry IV succeeded in defeating his opponents militarily and even conquering Rome. Gregory VII had to flee the city and died in exile a few years later. But the fundamental conflict between the emperor and the pope remained. It was not until decades later that a final solution was found. In 1122, Emperor Henry V, the son of Henry IV, and Pope Calixtus II concluded an agreement that became known as the Concordat of Worms. A compromise was agreed in this contract. The church was given the right to elect bishops and abbots, while the emperor continued to play a role in the granting of secular rights. This ended the investiture in its previous form. The Investiture Controversy had an enormous impact on medieval Europe. It fundamentally changed the relationship between church and state and at the same time weakened the authority of the emperors in the empire. Many princes had learned to expand their own power during the conflict. As a result, the empire became more politically decentralized. But despite these difficulties, the empire remained a central institution of European politics. New dynasties were soon to try to strengthen the emperor's power again. One of these families was to become particularly famous, not least because of an emperor whose name is still associated with legends, crusades, and medieval power politics: Frederick Barbarossa. In the next chapter, we see how this emperor tried to restore the authority of the empire, and why his reign became one of the most famous chapters of the German Imperial era. Chapter 8: Frederick Barbarossa, Myth and Reality. When the Salian dynasty ended in the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire was politically shaken. The Investiture Controversy had weakened the authority of the emperors, many princes had expanded their power, and the balance between emperor, nobility, and church had become more delicate than ever before. In this situation, a new ruling family appeared on the scene, the Hohenstaufen. The most important representative of this dynasty was a man whose name still sounds almost legendary today, Frederick I, better known as Frederick Barbarossa. The epithet Barbarossa, which means red beard in Italian, referred to his striking reddish beard. But his reputation in history is not based on his appearance, but on his political role as one of the most powerful emperors of the Middle Ages. Frederick was born around the year 1122. His family belonged to the most important noble families of the empire. His mother came from the rival Guelph family, while his father was a leading representative of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. This origin would later play an important role. The rivalry between the Hohenstaufen and the Guelphs was one of the central conflicts in imperial politics in the 12th century. When Frederick was elected king of the empire in 1152, many princes hoped that he would be able to overcome the political tensions between the various noble groups. Frederick understood very quickly that his rule would only be successful if he took into account the interests of the princes as well as strengthened the authority of the emperor again. His political goal was clear: to renew the power and prestige of the empire. One area in particular played a central role: Italy. In the Middle Ages, Italy was an important part of the Holy Roman Empire, but the emperor's actual control over Italian cities was often limited. Especially in the north of Italy, many wealthy cities developed that increasingly wanted to act independently. Cities such as Milan, Verona, or Bologna were economically strong and politically self-confident. Its citizens organized themselves in communal structures and wanted to defend their autonomy against the emperor. Frederick Barbarossa, however, was determined to assert imperial authority in Italy as well. Shortly after his election, he began a series of Italian expeditions. These military expeditions took him across the Alps several times to strengthen the emperor's power in the Italian cities. At the beginning, his campaigns were successful. Some cities submitted to his authority, and Frederick solemnly confirmed his rights as emperor. An important moment was the Imperial Assembly of Roncaglia in 1158. There Frederick tried to legally define and strengthen the imperial rights over the Italian cities. But these measures met with increasing resistance. Many Italian cities did not want to give up their political independence. They began to ally with each other. This resistance eventually gave rise to a powerful alliance, the Lombard League. This amalgamation of several northern Italian cities was supported by Pope Alexander III, who had also come into conflict with Barbarossa. The conflict between the emperor and the pope had several causes. On the one hand, it was about political power in Italy. On the other hand, the old question that had already arisen in the Investiture Controversy also played a role: who has the highest authority in Christian Europe, the emperor or the pope? Frederick saw himself as a secular ruler with universal aspirations, while the pope defended his own spiritual authority. These tensions eventually led to open military conflicts. The decisive moment came in 1176. In the Battle of Legnano, the emperor's army met the troops of the Lombard League. Despite his military experience, Barbarossa suffered a heavy defeat in this battle. This defeat showed that even a powerful emperor could not change Italy's political realities simply by military force. After this defeat, Frederick was forced to accept a compromise. In 1183, the Peace of Constance was concluded. In this treaty, the emperor recognized many freedoms of the Italian cities, while in return they accepted his formal supremacy. This compromise was an important step towards stabilizing the political situation. But Barbarossa's importance was not limited to Italy. He also played a central role in the empire itself. He tried to maintain the balance between the powerful princes while maintaining the authority of the emperor. A famous conflict of this time concerned Henry the Lion, one of the most powerful princes of the empire. Henry belonged to the Guelph family and controlled large parts of northern Germany, including Saxony and Bavaria. His power was so great that it became a potential threat to the emperor. When Henry refused to support Barbarossa in a military campaign, the emperor took the opportunity to take action against him. In 1180, Henry the Lion was condemned at an imperial assembly and removed from his duchies. His territories were divided among several other princes. This decision showed that the emperor still had considerable political authority, at least if he could win the support of other princes. But in addition to the political reality, a legend also developed around Frederick Barbarossa that is still part of German culture today. According to the so-called Barbarossa saga, the emperor did not really die. Instead, he is to sleep in a mountain, often called the Kyffhäuser in Thuringia, and return one day to lead the empire back to its former greatness. Although this legend did not emerge until many centuries later, it shows the impression Barbarossa's rule had left on the people. However, his actual life story ended far away from Germany. In 1189, Frederick Barbarossa joined the Third Crusade. This crusade was organized after Muslim troops under Sultan Saladin recaptured the city of Jerusalem. Barbarossa led a large army through Eastern Europe and Asia Minor towards the Holy Land. But on this long march a tragic accident occurred. In 1190, while crossing a river in present-day Anatolia, Frederick Barbarossa drowned. His sudden death shook the Crusader army and considerably weakened the crusade. With Barbarossa's death, the empire lost one of its most important rulers. His son Henry VI was to succeed him on the imperial throne, but the political stability of the empire remained a challenge. Nevertheless, Barbarossa left behind a strong historical legacy. He had tried to strengthen the authority of the emperor again, stabilize the political structures of the empire and redefine the idea of the empire. Even though he was not able to achieve all his goals, his reign is considered one of the most formative periods of the medieval empire. But the history of the Hohenstaufen was not over yet. A later ruler of this dynasty was to take the empire to a whole new level, an emperor who was not only a warrior and politician, but also a scholar, diplomat, and visionary. His name was Frederick II, and his reign was to mark both the climax and the beginning of the end of the Hohenstaufen imperial period. Chapter 9: The Stoffers, the Height and Fall of a Dynasty. After the death of Frederick Barbarossa in 1190, the Holy Roman Empire was once again facing a turning point. Barbarossa had tried for decades to strengthen the emperor's power and stabilize the political order of the empire. But as so often in history, the decisive question arose: could his work be continued by the next generations? His son Henry VI initially succeeded him. Henry had already been elected king during his father's lifetime and therefore had a certain political experience. Unlike Barbarossa, he focused less on military campaigns in the empire itself and more on a larger vision for the empire. A decisive factor in this was his marriage. Henry had married Constance of Sicily, who was heiress to the Norman kingdom of Sicily. This kingdom included not only the island of Sicily, but also large parts of southern Italy. This marriage opened up an extraordinary political opportunity for Henry: the union of the Holy Roman Empire with one of the richest and most strategically important kingdoms in the Mediterranean. After Constance had laid claim to the Sicilian throne, Henry led several campaigns into Italy. Finally, in 1194, he managed to gain control of the Kingdom of Sicily. This created an unusual political constellation. The emperor of the empire now ruled over a powerful kingdom in the south of Italy at the same time. For many observers, this seemed to be an enormous strengthening of imperial power. But this development also made the Pope increasingly nervous. The Papal State was geographically located between the empire in the north and the Kingdom of Sicily in the south. If both territories were controlled by the same dynasty, the Pope could easily be politically isolated. These tensions should play an important role in the coming decades. But Henry VI was not able to fully realize his great political plans. He died unexpectedly in 1197 at the age of only 32. His son Friedrich was only a small child at that time. This child would later become known as one of the most fascinating rulers of the Middle Ages, Frederick II. Friedrich first grew up in Sicily, a culturally extraordinary place. The Kingdom of Sicily was a unique mix of different cultures in the Middle Ages. Normans, Byzantines, Arabs, and Italians lived together there. Different languages, religions, and scientific traditions shaped social life. This environment had a great influence on Friedrich's development. He learned several languages, was interested in science, philosophy, and natural history, and developed an unusually open view of different cultures. Later, some contemporaries even referred to it as Stupor Mundi, the amazement of the world. But before Frederick could shape his own policy, he first had to fight for his power. After the death of his father, a phase of political uncertainty began in the Reich. Different noble groups supported different candidates for the royal throne. There was a so-called double election conflict between the Hohenstaufen and their rivals from the Guelph family. For several years, there were even two competing kings in the empire. Only after many political and military conflicts was Frederick II finally able to secure his position. In 1212 he was elected king of the empire, and a few years later he also officially received the imperial crown. But Frederick's reign differed significantly from that of his predecessors. While previous emperors had spent a large part of their time in the northern part of the empire, Frederick often stayed in Sicily. There he focused on building a strong and centralized kingdom. In Sicily, Frederick carried out extensive reforms. He organized an efficient administration, codified laws, and even founded a university, the University of Naples in 1224, one of the first state universities in Europe. His interest in science and culture was exceptional for a medieval ruler. Friedrich was involved in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and even the observation of animals. A famous work of his is a book on falconry, which contains detailed observations about birds. But while Frederick was building up a relatively modern administration in Sicily, his relationship with the Pope became increasingly problematic. The Pope saw Frederick as a great threat. Not only did he control Sicily in the south and large parts of the empire in the north, he also showed an independent political stance that did not always coincide with the interests of the Church. The conflict between the emperor and the Pope escalated several times. Frederick was excommunicated several times in the course of his life. One particularly noteworthy event concerned his crusade. The Pope had obliged Frederick to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. But Friedrich postponed the expedition several times, which led to growing criticism. Finally, in 1228, he set out on a crusade, albeit under unusual circumstances. By this time, he had already been excommunicated. Nevertheless, he succeeded in doing something that many other crusaders had not managed before. Instead of conquering Jerusalem militarily, Frederick negotiated with a Muslim ruler Al-Kamil, a nephew of the famous Sultan Saladin. Through diplomatic talks, Frederick reached a treaty that secured him control of Jerusalem, at least for a few years. This diplomatic solution came as a surprise to many contemporaries. However, it showed Frederick's ability to resolve political conflicts without military force. But in the Reich itself, the situation remained complicated. Since Frederick often lived in Italy or Sicily, the German princes gained increasing influence. Many regional rulers took advantage of this situation to strengthen their own territories. In the long term, this development led to a greater fragmentation of political power in the Reich. When Frederick II died in 1250, he left behind an impressive but also unstable political legacy. His successors could not maintain his power. His son Conrad IV died just a few years later, and the last important representative of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, Conradin, was executed in 1268 after a failed attempt to reconquer Sicily. With his death, the dynasty of the Hohenstaufen dynasty finally ended. But their demise had far-reaching consequences. In the empire, a phase began that historians later referred to as the Interregnum, a time in which there was no universally recognized emperor. Several rival kings claimed power, while many princes expanded their own independence. This phase of political uncertainty lasted several decades. It clearly showed how strongly the empire had depended on the personality of its rulers. Only later did a new dynasty succeed in regaining the imperial crown permanently. But the political structure of the empire had changed in the meantime. Power was more distributed, princes had become more self-confident, and the emperor's authority was no longer as unchallenged as it had been in earlier centuries. In the next chapter, we will see how the empire developed in this new political reality, and how one family would eventually dominate the imperial throne for centuries. Chapter 10: The Late Middle Ages. Emperors without a strong central power. After the fall of the Hohenstaufen dynasty in the 13th century, the Holy Roman Empire found itself in a profound political crisis. With the death of Frederick II in 1250 and the subsequent execution of his grandson Conradin in 1268, one of the most powerful ruling families of the Middle Ages had finally disappeared. But with its end, an important stabilizing factor in the empire also disappeared. It began a period that historians later refer to as the Interregnum, a period of political uncertainty in which there was no universally recognized emperor and several rival rulers fought for power. The word interregnum literally means intermediate rule. That was exactly what this time was, a political vacuum between two more stable phases of the Reich's history. During these years, the empire was increasingly dominated by the regional princes. Dukes, counts, bishops, and free cities used the weak central authority to expand their own territories and strengthen their political independence. This development was not completely new. Even before that, the princes had played an important role. But in the interregnum their power became even more visible. Several candidates claimed the title of king at the same time. Some were supported by certain groups of princes, others by rival noble families. Without a strong central authority, the empire remained politically fragmented. It was not until 1273 that this phase was finally completed. In that year, the electors of the empire elected a new king, Rudolf von Habsburg. This election marked the beginning of the rise of a family that would later be associated with the imperial dignity for centuries. But at that time, Rudolf was by no means an overpowering candidate. On the contrary, the electors deliberately chose him because he was considered relatively moderate and controllable compared to other nobles. The princes did not want a ruler who could become too powerful. However, Rudolf understood very quickly how to strengthen his position. One of his most important political measures was the recovery of Reichsland, which had been occupied by various nobles during the interregnum. Especially in the territory of Austria, he succeeded in asserting his authority. This region was later to become the core area of the Habsburgs. Despite these successes, however, Rudolf did not succeed in obtaining the imperial crown himself. He remained king of the empire throughout his reign without ever being officially crowned emperor. This shows an important feature of imperial policy in the late Middle Ages. The title of German king was the prerequisite for the empire, but in order to become emperor, a ruler traditionally had to travel to Rome and be crowned by the Pope there. This journey was often politically and militarily difficult, and not every king was able to carry it out. After Rudolf's death in 1291, this complicated political dynamic continued. Various noble families competed for the royal dignity. In some cases, two rival kings were even elected at the same time, which led to political tensions again. A new political institution was particularly important at this time, the electorate. Even in the past, some princes had played an important role in the election of the king. But in the course of the 13th and 14th centuries, a fixed system developed from it. Finally, it was determined that 7 electors had the right to elect the king of the empire. This group consisted of 3 ecclesiastical princes, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, as well as 4 secular princes, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. This regulation was later officially confirmed in 1356. The then Emperor Charles IV issued an important document that became known as the Golden Bull. This law finally determined how the election of kings in the empire was to take place. The Golden Bull was one of the most important constitutional documents of the medieval empire. It stabilized the political system by establishing clear rules for the election of the king. At the same time, however, it also confirmed the enormous power of the electors. Because the king, and thus the future emperor, was now completely dependent on her election. This structure greatly distinguished the Holy Roman Empire from other European monarchies. In countries such as France or England, a stronger central monarchy developed in the course of the Middle Ages. Power was increasingly concentrated with the king. In the Reich, on the other hand, political power remained distributed among many different actors. Although the emperor was formally the supreme ruler, his actual authority depended heavily on whether he could win the support of the princes. This political structure led to many emperors in the late Middle Ages acting less as absolute rulers and more as arbitrators between the princes. One of the most important personalities of this time was Charles IV from the Luxembourg dynasty. Charles was elected king in 1346 and later crowned emperor. He was an educated and diplomatically skilled ruler who was strongly interested in culture and education. Under his rule, Prague became an important political and cultural center of Europe. Charles founded the University of Prague in 1348, one of the oldest universities in Central Europe. He also had numerous buildings built, including the famous Charles Bridge. Politically, Charles concentrated on stabilizing the empire rather than pursuing major military expansions. The Golden Bull of 1356 was a central part of this policy. It created a relatively stable political system that would last for several centuries. But despite this stabilization, the empire remained a federal entity in which many regions had a great deal of autonomy. During this time, the imperial cities also developed into important political actors. Many cities received direct rights from the emperor and were therefore no longer subordinate to the local princes. These so-called free imperial cities developed into important economic centers. Trade, crafts, and early forms of municipal self-government shaped their political life. At the same time, large trade networks emerged in Northern Europe, especially the Hanseatic League, an association of merchants and cities that dominated trade in the Baltic Sea region. This economic development changed the political landscape of Europe. Cities became increasingly wealthy and self-confident, while traditional feudal structures slowly lost their importance. But the empire remained a political system that was strongly characterized by compromise. The emperor constantly had to mediate between different interests, between princes, cities, church, and regional noble families. This situation led to many emperors in the late Middle Ages being perceived less as powerful emperors and more as political moderators. Nevertheless, the symbolic significance of the empire remained enormous. The emperor continued to be considered the supreme ruler of the Christian Empire in Western Europe, a title that went back to a tradition that stretched back to Charlemagne and even Roman antiquity. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, however, a new development began to emerge. A certain dynasty gained more and more influence on the election of the emperor, a family that had already achieved its first major political success with Rudolf von Habsburg. This family would eventually dominate the imperial throne for centuries. Her name was Habsburg. In the next chapter, we will see how this dynasty managed to bind the empire to itself in the long term and why its rule had a decisive influence on the political history of Europe. Chapter 11: The Habsburgs, Centuries on the Imperial Throne. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the Holy Roman Empire had developed into a unique political entity. It was not a centralized state like France or England, but a complex network of principalities, bishoprics, free cities, and regional dominions. Although the emperor was formally at the head of this system, his power depended heavily on the support of the princes. In this political landscape, one family slowly but steadily began to gain more and more influence: the Habsburgs. The rise of this dynasty had already begun in the 13th century with Rudolf von Habsburg. But it was not until several generations later that the family succeeded in securing their power permanently. The decisive turning point came in the late 15th century. In 1438, Albrecht II of Habsburg was elected king of the empire. This election marked the beginning of a phase in which almost all emperors of the Holy Roman Empire were to come from the Habsburg family. This dominance lasted, with few interruptions, for several centuries. But how did the Habsburgs manage to achieve this extraordinary political position? An important reason was her strategic marriage policy. The Habsburgs understood early on that political power could arise not only through wars, but also through clever dynastic connections. Instead of constantly conquering new territories militarily, they often tried to gain territory by marrying. A famous sentence from that time sums up this strategy. Bella gerent alii, tu felix Austria nube. In German, this means something like, others may wage wars, you happy Austria marry. This policy became particularly visible under Maximilian I. Maximilian, who became emperor in 1493, is considered one of the most important Habsburg rulers. He knew how to forge dynastic alliances. One of his most important decisions was the marriage of his son Philip the Fair to Joan of Castile, the daughter of the Spanish kings Ferdinand and Isabella. This union had enormous political consequences. It created a dynastic connection between the Habsburgs and the Spanish crown. In the next generation, this led to a single ruler ruling over a vast territory in Europe and beyond. This ruler was Charles V. Charles V was elected emperor in 1519 and controlled one of the largest political empires in the world at the time. His rule included not only large parts of the Holy Roman Empire, but also Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and even the newly emerging colonial territories in the Americas. It was often said at that time that in Charlemagne's empire the sun never set, because it was always day somewhere on his territories. But this enormous power also brought enormous challenges. Charles had to deal with numerous political and military conflicts. Particularly important was the conflict with the Ottoman Empire, which was one of the greatest powers of its time under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The Ottomans advanced further and further into Central Europe and even threatened Vienna. Charles had to take military action against them several times. But it was not only external enemies that posed a challenge. Within the empire, a movement arose that was to fundamentally change the religious order of Europe, the Reformation. In 1517, the monk Martin Luther published his famous 95 Theses, in which he criticized various practices of the Catholic Church. What initially began as a theological dispute quickly developed into a religious and political movement that encompassed large parts of Europe. Many princes in the empire supported the Reformation, partly out of religious conviction, partly for political reasons. Through the introduction of Protestantism, they were able to detach themselves more from the authority of the Catholic Church. For Charles V, this development was extremely problematic. As emperor, he saw himself as the protector of the Catholic unity of Europe. At the same time, however, he had to negotiate with the Protestant princes in the empire in order to maintain political stability. These tensions eventually led to several military conflicts. The most famous of these was the Schmalkaldic War, a conflict between Catholic and Protestant forces in the empire. Although Charles achieved some military successes, he ultimately failed to restore the religious unity of the empire. In 1555, a compromise was finally reached, the Peace of Augsburg. This agreement allowed the princes of the empire to decide for themselves whether their territories should be Catholic or Protestant. The principle was cuius regio, ius religio, whose territory, whose religion. This officially recognized the religious division of the empire. Shortly afterwards, Karl made a surprising decision. In 1556, he abdicated as emperor. His vast empire was divided between different members of his family. The Spanish territories went to his son Philip II, while the Austrian territories and the claim to the imperial crown passed to his brother Ferdinand I. This division led to the emergence of two Habsburg lines, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. In the Holy Roman Empire, the imperial dignity henceforth remained with the Austrian line. In the centuries that followed, the Habsburgs provided the emperors of the empire almost continuously, but her rule was still marked by challenges. Religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants remained. These conflicts finally escalated in the 17th century in one of the most devastating wars in European history, the 30 Years' War. This war was to shake the empire politically, economically, and demographically severely. But despite this catastrophe, the Habsburgs managed to retain their position as emperor. Over time, their own territory, especially Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, developed into a powerful state within Europe. This created an interesting political situation. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was also the ruler of his own, relatively strong territory. This combination of imperial dignity and territorial power made the Habsburgs one of the most influential dynasties in Europe. But over the centuries, the political world around them also changed. New nation-states emerged, economic structures changed, and political ideas continued to develop. The medieval empire, once intended to be the universal authority over the Christian world, increasingly had to adapt to a new reality. In the next chapter, we will see how religious conflicts and political rivalries eventually led to a war that almost completely destroyed the empire. The 30 Years' War. Chapter 12, Reformation and the 30 Years' War. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire seemed at first glance to have a stable political order. The Habsburgs provided the emperor, the princes administered their territories, and the Church continued to play a central role in the religious and social life of Europe. But under this apparent stability, tensions developed that would soon lead to one of the greatest upheavals in European history. The trigger for this development was a theological conflict that began in 1517. In that year, the German monk Martin Luther published his famous 95 Theses. In these theses, Luther criticized, among other things, the so-called sale of indulgences, a practice of the Catholic Church in which believers could allegedly reduce the punishment of sins in exchange for monetary payments. Luther saw this as a distortion of Christian doctrine. However, his criticism was soon no longer directed only against individual practices, but against fundamental structures of the Church. Luther asked questions about the authority of the Pope, about the role of the Bible, and about the relationship between faith and church institutions. What was originally intended as an academic discussion spread surprisingly quickly. An important reason for this was a relatively new technology, the printing press. The printing press made it possible to reproduce Luther's writings quickly and distribute them in many parts of Europe. Within a few years, this theological debate gave rise to a broad religious movement. This movement later became known as the Reformation. In the Holy Roman Empire, the Reformation found a particularly strong echo. Many people supported Luther's criticism of the Church, but political factors also played a major role. Several princes saw the Reformation as an opportunity to strengthen their own independence. If they broke away from the Pope and the Catholic Church, they could gain more control over religious affairs in their territories. This development presented the then Emperor Charles V with a difficult task. Charles was a staunch Catholic and considered himself a defender of the religious unity of Europe. At the same time, however, he was also the ruler of a huge empire that brought with it numerous political challenges. In addition to the religious conflicts in the empire, he also had to deal with wars against France and the Ottoman Empire. This multitude of problems made it difficult for Charles to concentrate exclusively on the religious question. In 1521, a decisive moment took place, the Diet of Worms. There Martin Luther was called upon to recant his teachings. In front of the emperor and numerous princes, however, Luther declared that he could not take back his convictions. The famous phrase attributed to him is, "Here I stand. I can't help it." After this event, Luther was officially ostracized, but his ideas could not be stopped. In the course of the next decades, the Reformation spread further. Many regions of the empire became Protestant, while others remained Catholic. This religious division led to political tensions between different princes. Eventually, a military alliance of Protestant princes was formed, the so-called Schmalkaldic League. Charles V tried to suppress this movement by military force. In the Schmalkaldic War, He initially succeeded in achieving some military successes. But in the long term, he was unable to reverse the religious division. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg was finally concluded. This agreement stipulated that the princes in the empire could decide for themselves whether their territory should be Catholic or Protestant. The principle was cuius regio, ius religio, whose territory, whose religion. This compromise brought temporary stability, but did not solve all problems. In particular, the adherents of a third Reformation movement, the Calvinists, had not been taken into account in this agreement. In the decades that followed, tensions between different religious groups persisted. These conflicts finally escalated at the beginning of the 17th century. The immediate trigger was an event in the city of Prague in 1618. There was a dramatic incident that became known as the Prague Defenestration. Protestant nobles threw two imperial governors out of a window of Prague Castle. This event symbolized the open uprising against the Catholic rule of the Habsburgs in Bohemia. What initially began as a regional conflict quickly developed into a major war. This war would later become known as the 30 Years' War. The conflict lasted from 1618 to 1648 and developed into one of the most devastating wars in European history. Several major powers intervened in the war. Initially, it was mainly Catholic and Protestant forces within the empire that fought against each other. But foreign powers soon intervened, including Denmark, Sweden, and finally France. The war developed from a religious conflict into a complex political power struggle. The fighting devastated large parts of Central Europe. Many regions of the empire were repeatedly sacked by various armies. Cities were destroyed, fields devastated, and entire villages depopulated. The civilian population in particular suffered from the consequences of the war. Historians estimate that in some regions up to a third of the population died, from fighting, hunger, or disease. The economic damage was enormous. Trade routes collapsed, agriculture was destroyed, and many cities lost their importance as economic centers. The war also changed the empire profoundly politically. After 3 decades of devastation, many of those involved were finally exhausted. Therefore, peace negotiations began in the 1640s. These negotiations eventually led to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The peace treaty was negotiated in the cities of Münster and Osnabrück and officially ended the 30 Years' War. The political consequences of this peace were far-reaching. The Peace of Westphalia once again confirmed the religious division of the empire. Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists were now officially recognized as equal denominations. In addition, the princes of the empire were given even greater political rights. They could now form their own alliances and administer their territories largely independently, as long as they did not take direct action against the emperor. Thus, the Holy Roman Empire finally became a loose confederation of states made up of many relatively autonomous territories. The emperor remained an important symbolic figure, but his actual political power was now significantly limited. At the same time, the Peace of Westphalia also changed international politics. The idea that sovereign states could make their own political decisions became an important principle of European diplomacy. Many historians therefore see the Peace of Westphalia as an important step in the development of the modern state system. For the Holy Roman Empire, however, this peace also meant that the time of a strong empire was finally over. The empire continued to exist, and the Habsburgs continued to provide the emperors, but the political reality had changed. Europe increasingly developed in the direction of stronger nation-states. This development was ultimately to lead to a new political order in the 19th century, an order in which the old empire of emperors could no longer exist. In the next chapter, we will see how this development ultimately led to the end of the Holy Roman Empire, and how a new emperor would rule over a German empire again many years later. Chapter 13, The End of the Holy Roman Empire, 1806. For more than 8 centuries, the Holy Roman Empire had shaped the political landscape of Central Europe. Its origins went back to the coronation of Charlemagne as emperor in 800 and the later coronation of Otto the Great in 962. 4 generations, emperors, princes, bishops and cities had shaped this complex political system. But over time, Europe had changed a lot. New ideas, new political structures and new military powers emerged. While other states were increasingly centralized, the Holy Roman Empire remained a loose association of many individual territories. This structure functioned relatively stable for centuries, but towards the end of the 18th century it began to come under increasing pressure. A decisive trigger for these changes was the French Revolution, which began in 1789. This revolution challenged many traditional notions of power and domination. The revolutionaries in France declared that political authority should no longer arise solely from dynastic descent or divine right, but from the will of the people. These ideas quickly spread throughout Europe. Many monarchies initially saw the revolution as a threat. Several European powers, including the Holy Roman Empire, waged war against revolutionary France. But out of these conflicts emerged a new military figure who was to fundamentally change the political order of Europe: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was an exceptionally talented military leader. In the years following the revolution, he managed to achieve a number of spectacular military victories. Eventually, he himself took political power in France. Under Napoleon's leadership, France began to expand its military strength throughout Europe. Napoleon's armies were modernly organized and extremely effective. In several campaigns, they defeated the traditional monarchies of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire also came under increasing pressure. The political structures of the empire were complex and often cumbersome. While Napoleon was able to make quick military decisions, the emperor often had to negotiate with numerous princes and political institutions. This made it difficult to defend effectively. A particularly important turning point came in 1805. In that year, Napoleon defeated a grand coalition of European powers in the famous Battle of Austerlitz. This victory finally made him a dominant political figure in Europe. The consequences for the Holy Roman Empire were dramatic. Napoleon began to reshape the political map of Central Europe. Many smaller principalities were dissolved or merged with larger territories. Numerous German states became allies of France. In 1806, Napoleon finally founded the Confederation of the Rhine, an alliance of several German states that placed themselves under French protection. These states officially left the Holy Roman Empire. As a result, the empire lost a large part of its members. For the then Emperor Franz II, the situation became increasingly untenable. Franz came from the Habsburg dynasty and had been emperor of the Holy Roman Empire since 1792. At the same time, he was also ruler of the Austrian Empire, which he had founded in 1804. As more and more German states joined the Confederation of the Rhine, it became clear that the old empire had lost its political importance. On August 6, 1806, Francis II finally made a historic decision. He officially declared that the Holy Roman Empire had been dissolved. With this declaration, he laid down the imperial crown and released the imperial princes from their duty of loyalty to the empire. After more than 1,000 years of history, the Holy Roman Empire no longer existed. This event marked a deep turning point in European history. A political system that had existed since the early Middle Ages had now disappeared for good. But the reasons for this downfall were not only of a military nature. Structural problems had already become apparent in the Reich long before. The political fragmentation, the strong role of the princes, and the limited power of the emperor had made the empire less capable of acting than other European states. While France, England, and Russia increasingly developed centralized state structures, the empire remained a complex network of regional rulers. This structure had worked for centuries, but in the era of modern nation-states it became increasingly problematic. Napoleon's military successes finally accelerated a process that had been looming for some time. But although the Holy Roman Empire disappeared, the idea of a German empire did not disappear. On the contrary, many people in German-speaking countries now began to think about what a new political order could look like. In the course of the 19th century, various political movements emerged that demanded greater German unity. These developments were closely linked to new ideas, such as nationalism, the idea that people with a common language, culture, and history should also form a common state. But the road to such a state was long and complicated. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was reorganized at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. In place of the old Reich, the German Confederation was created, a loose association of German states. But even this federation was not a unified state. Rather, Germany remained politically fragmented. Two powers dominated German politics particularly strongly: Austria and Prussia. In the course of the 19th century, political competition developed between these two states for leadership in the German area. This rivalry would eventually lead to a series of political crises and wars. At the end of this process, a completely new political entity emerged. An empire that took up the old imperial title again, but existed in a completely different political world than the medieval empire. In 1871, a new German emperor was finally proclaimed. But this emperor was no longer the ruler of a medieval empire with many autonomous princes. He was the head of a modern nation-state. In the next chapter, we will see how this new empire was founded, and how the German Empire came into being, which was to shape Germany until the beginning of the 20th century. Chapter 14, The German Empire, 1871 to 1918. After the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, there was no longer a German emperor for a long time. The German-speaking area remained politically fragmented and consisted of numerous kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities. Although these states were united in the German Confederation after the Napoleonic Wars, this confederation was more of a loose association than a real state. In the course of the 19th century, however, a new political idea began to spread more and more: the idea of a German nation-state. Many people believed that the German states should be politically united because of their common language, culture, and history. This idea was particularly strengthened by the political upheavals of the time. The Industrial Revolution changed the economy and society, new political movements emerged, and many citizens demanded more co-determination. A first attempt to unite Germany took place during the Revolution of 1848. In many German cities, people took to the streets and demanded political reforms, a constitution, and national unity. In Frankfurt, a parliament even met to discuss a new German constitution. But this attempt ultimately failed. The revolution was crushed by conservative forces, and the political princes were largely able to retain their power. However, the idea of a united Germany did not disappear; it continued to develop. In the second half of the 19th century, Prussia became the most important political actor in Germany. Prussia was a powerful state with a strong army and a growing industry. One man in particular played a decisive role in Prussian politics at the time: Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck had been Prime Minister of Prussia since 1862. He was a skilled diplomat and a realistic politician who believed that great political decisions were made not only through discussion, but also through power politics. His sentence that the big questions of the time would be decided by iron and blood became famous. Bismarck's goal was to achieve German unity under the leadership of Prussia. To achieve this goal, he used a series of political and military conflicts. The first of these conflicts was the German-Danish War of 1864. In this war, Prussia and Austria fought together against Denmark for control of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. After the victory over Denmark, these territories were divided under Prussian and Austrian administration. But this joint administration soon led to tensions between Prussia and Austria. Bismarck deliberately used these tensions to bring about another conflict. In 1866, the Austro-Prussian War broke out between Prussia and Austria. This war lasted only a few weeks, but it had enormous political consequences. In the decisive Battle of Königgrätz, the Prussian army defeated the Austrian troops by a clear margin. After this victory, the German Confederation was dissolved. It was replaced by the North German Confederation, a new confederation of states under the leadership of Prussia. Austria was excluded from German politics. But many southern German states, including Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, were not yet part of this federation. The decisive step towards complete German unity came a few years later. In 1870, the Franco-German War broke out. This war arose from political tensions between France and Prussia. Bismarck skillfully used diplomatic situations to make France appear as the aggressor. When the war began, the southern German states also sided with Prussia. The German armies were able to achieve several decisive victories. Particularly important was the Battle of Sedan, in which the French Emperor Napoleon III was captured. The military success led to a strong national enthusiasm in the German states. Many people now saw the right moment to complete German unity. Finally, on January 18, 1871, a historic event took place. In the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles, the Prussian King Wilhelm I was proclaimed German Emperor. This ceremony gave rise to the German Empire. However, this new empire was very different from the old Holy Roman Empire. It was not a loose association of many independent territories, but a modern nation-state with a central government. Although the emperor was the head of state, other institutions also played an important role. There was a Reichstag, which was elected by the citizens, and a Bundesrat, which represented the interests of the individual German states. However, the actual political power often lay with the Reich Chancellor, and this post was initially occupied by Otto von Bismarck himself. Under Bismarck's leadership, the German Empire quickly developed into an important European great power. The economy grew rapidly, especially due to industrial development. New factories were built, railways were built, and Germany developed into one of Europe's leading industrial nations. At the same time, Bismarck conducted a complex foreign policy. His goal was to maintain the balance of power in Europe and avoid major conflicts. Therefore, he made several alliances with other states and tried to isolate France diplomatically. But there were also political conflicts within the empire. An important conflict was the so-called Kulturkampf, a political dispute between the government and the Catholic Church. Bismarck tried to limit the influence of the Church on political affairs. Another conflict arose from the growing labor movement. With industrialization, a new social group emerged, the industrial workers. Many of them worked under difficult conditions and demanded political reforms. Bismarck reacted to these developments in two different ways. On the one hand, he tried to suppress socialist movements. On the other hand, he introduced some of the world's first social laws, including health insurance, accident insurance, and pension insurance. These reforms were intended to reduce social tensions and strengthen workers' loyalty to the state. After many years in power, Bismarck finally resigned. The new Kaiser Wilhelm II, who ascended the throne in 1888, had different political ideas than his chancellor. Wilhelm wanted to play a more active role in politics and pursued a much more aggressive foreign policy. Under Wilhelm II, Germany began to further expand its military strength. In particular, the establishment of a large war fleet led to tensions with Great Britain, one of the world's leading maritime powers. These rivalries contributed to the fact that the political situation in Europe became increasingly acute. In 1914, the First World War finally broke out. Germany, together with Austria-Hungary and other allies, fought against a coalition of France, Great Britain, Russia, and later the United States. The war developed into a long and extremely destructive conflict. After 4 years of war, Germany was economically exhausted and militarily weakened. In 1918, riots broke out in many German cities. Workers and soldiers protested against the war and against the monarchical government. Finally, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate. On November 9, 1918, the monarchy in Germany ended. With the fall of Wilhelm II, the last German emperor also disappeared from political history. The German Empire was replaced by a new form of government, a republic. But although the empire ended in Germany, its history remained an important part of Europe's past. From Charlemagne to Wilhelm II, emperors had shaped the political development of Europe for more than 1,000 years. In the last chapter, we take a look at the legacy left behind by the German emperors, and why their history remains fascinating to this day. Chapter 15, Epilogue, the legacy of the German emperors. When the German Emperor Wilhelm II abdicated in November 1918 and the German Empire collapsed, a political tradition that had shaped the history of Europe for over a millennium came to an end. From the coronation of Charlemagne in 800 to the end of the monarchy in the early 20th century, the title of emperor was a symbol of power, authority, and political order. But although the empire disappeared as a political institution, its historical legacy remained. The history of the German emperors is in many ways also the history of Europe itself. For centuries, emperors determined political developments, waged wars, made alliances, and tried again and again to hold together a huge and diverse empire. However, this empire was never a unified state in the modern sense. The Holy Roman Empire was a unique political system. It consisted of hundreds of territories, duchies, principalities, bishoprics, and free cities, all with their own interests and traditions. Although the emperor was at the head of this system, his power was often limited. It was precisely this structure that made the empire stable and complicated at the same time. Stable because many regions were able to retain their own autonomy. Complicated because political decisions often had to be made through lengthy negotiations between different actors. This special structure meant that the empire was able to exist for many centuries, even when individual emperors were weaker or political conflicts arose. An important part of the imperial heritage is also the close connection between religion and politics that shaped medieval Europe. From the Investiture Controversy to the Reformation, the question of who had the highest authority in the Christian world played a central role. Emperors and popes were always in competition with each other. These conflicts influenced not only the structure of the empire, but also the development of Europe as a whole. The Reformation and the 30 Years' War eventually led to a new political order in which religious diversity was more widely accepted and state sovereignty played a greater role. The emperors also left clear cultural traces. Many of the most famous cities in Central Europe owe part of their development to the political decisions of imperial rulers. Cities such as Aachen, Nuremberg, Prague, and Vienna were important centers of the empire for a long time. Emperors supported universities, promoted art and architecture, and influenced the development of legal systems and administrative structures. An example of this is the Golden Bull of 1356, which laid down clear rules for the election of the king in the empire. This document was one of the most important political foundations of the empire for several centuries. The empire also had great economic influence. The numerous free imperial cities developed into important trading centers. Merchants from different regions of Europe met at markets and fairs, exchanged goods, and contributed to the economic development of the continent. Trade networks such as the Hanseatic League connected cities in the Baltic Sea region and created an early form of international economic cooperation. But the legacy of the emperors is not only visible in political or economic structures. It also lives on in legends, stories, and cultural memories. One of the most famous legends is the story of Frederick Barbarossa, who supposedly did not die, but slept inside a mountain and would one day return to reunite the empire. Such stories show the impression the emperors left on people's imaginations. Traces of this history can also be found in the architecture. Castles, cathedrals, palaces, and city fortifications from the time of the emperors still shape the image of many European cities and landscapes today. These buildings are a reminder of how closely political power, religion, and culture were linked in medieval Europe. But in addition to these cultural traces, a political question also remains. What did the empire actually mean for the development of Germany? In contrast to many other European countries, Germany did not develop as a centralized state for a long time. Instead, the German-speaking world remained politically fragmented for centuries. This fragmentation had both advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, it made it difficult to develop a strong central government. On the other hand, it promoted regional diversity, cultural differences, and local traditions. Many historians see this diversity as an important part of German history. When a modern German nation-state finally emerged in the 19th century, the symbolism of the empire was deliberately used. The coronation of Wilhelm I as German emperor in 1871 was intended to commemorate the long tradition of emperors in the empire, even though the new empire was politically organized quite differently than the medieval empire. But this Second German Empire only existed for a few decades. The First World War and the political upheavals of 1918 finally ended the monarchy. Since then, Germany has been a republic. Nevertheless, the history of emperors remains an important part of Europe's past. It shows how political power can change over centuries. It shows how ideas of rule, religion, and state have been redefined again and again. And it also shows that history rarely runs in a straight line. The Imperial era was marked by great successes, but also by conflicts, crises, and changes. Empires emerged, grew, and fell apart again. But these developments gave rise to new political structures, new ideas, and new forms of coexistence. When we look back at the history of the German emperors today, we do not only see a number of rulers. We are seeing a 1,000-year development in which Europe has changed step by step. From medieval empires to religious conflicts and political reforms to the emergence of modern states, all these developments are closely linked to the history of emperors. And that's exactly why her story remains so fascinating to this day. Because it reminds us how deep the roots of our world today lie in the past.